Montana Territory, 1872. The dusty winds of Silverhorn Valley carried the unmistakable scent of approaching autumn as Quentin Stanton surveyed his expansive ranch from atop his chestnut gelding. At 26, Quentin had built an empire that stretched farther than the eye could see: 5,000 acres of prime cattle land, a two-story ranch house, and enough hired hands to run a small army. Yet despite his considerable wealth, a profound emptiness haunted him. He had long ago decided that the frontier was a place for building fortunes, not families. His father's words echoed in his mind. "The West takes more than it gives, son. A man builds with his hands, not his heart." The lesson had been reinforced when his parents' wagon train was ambushed by bandits when he was just 12. He survived only by hiding beneath the wagon while everyone he loved was slaughtered. After that day, Quentin swore never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. Attachments were weaknesses. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford. As he guided his horse down toward the main house, his foreman, Elijah, rode up alongside him. "Morning, boss. Got news from town. The Hammond place finally sold." Quentin frowned. The Hammond homestead bordered his northern pasture, a modest 100 acres with a small cabin and barn. Old man Hammond had died of pneumonia last winter, leaving the property vacant. "Who bought it?" Quentin asked. "Young widow name of Tabitha Hayes, 23 years old. Arrived on yesterday's stage with not much more than 2 trunks and determination. Husband died in the war, they say." Quentin's jaw tightened. "A woman alone trying to work that land? She won't last a month." "Might be right about that," Elijah agreed. "But Judge Miller already processed the deed. It's hers fair and square." The news irritated Quentin more than it should have. He had planned to acquire the Hammond place himself to expand his northern grazing lands. Now he'd have to deal with some city woman who'd likely abandon the place once she realized how harsh frontier life truly was. "Keep an eye on her," he instructed Elijah. "First sign she's looking to sell, I want to know." "Yes, sir." For 2 weeks, Quentin deliberately avoided riding near the Hammond property. But reports from his men piqued his curiosity. The widow had hired no help, but worked from dawn till dusk herself. She'd repaired the cabin roof, cleared the overgrown vegetable garden, and even mended the fence line. All tasks that seasoned men would find challenging. On the first day of October, curiosity finally got the better of him. Quentin rode north, telling himself he was merely checking his property boundaries. As he crested the ridge overlooking the Hammond place, he reined in his horse and stared. The transformation was remarkable. The cabin's exterior had been whitewashed, smoke curled from the chimney, and the yard was swept clean. In the garden, a slender figure bent over rows of freshly turned earth. As if sensing his presence, the woman straightened and turned toward him, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. Even from this distance, Quentin could see she was uncommonly beautiful. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid that caught the sunlight, and she wore a simple blue dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Before he could retreat, she raised her hand in greeting. "Caught." Quentin had no choice but to approach. "Good afternoon," she called as he rode down the slope. Her voice carried a gentle southern lilt. "Afternoon, ma'am." Quentin tipped his hat, keeping his expression neutral. "Quentin Stanton. I own the neighboring ranch." "Tabitha Hayes." She wiped her hands on her apron and offered one to him. "Though most folks call me Tabby." Her hand was small but calloused, her grip firm. Up close, Quentin was struck by her clear green eyes, which regarded him with intelligence and quiet strength. "You've done considerable work here," he said, gesturing to the property. She smiled, dimples appearing in her sun-kissed cheeks. "There's plenty more to do before winter. But the land is good." Mr. Hammond left detailed journals about the soil and weather patterns. "Mrs. Hayes." "Miss Hayes," she corrected. "I never married." The widow part is just what folks assumed when I arrived alone. This revelation caught him off guard. "You traveled west by yourself?" "I did. After my father and brother died at Gettysburg, there wasn't much left for me in Virginia." Her voice held no self-pity, only pragmatism. "I taught school for 5 years, saved every penny, and when I saw the advertisement for this homestead, I knew it was meant for me." Quentin frowned. "This isn't easy country, Miss Hayes. Winter comes hard and fast. Wolves take livestock. Men take advantage of women alone." Her smile faded. "Are you one of those men, Mr. Stanton?" "No, ma'am," he replied stiffly. "I'm simply stating facts. Then I'll state one back. I didn't come west looking for easy. Her chin lifted slightly. Now, would you care for coffee? It's freshly brewed. The invitation surprised him. Practical caution told him to refuse, to maintain distance, but something in her straightforward manner intrigued him. I suppose I could spare a few minutes. Inside the cabin, Quentin was struck by the homey touches Tabitha had already added: handmade curtains, a braided rug, and shelves lined with books. She poured coffee into 2 chipped but clean cups. I understand you've been quite successful, Mr. Stanton, she said, settling across from him at the small table. 20,000 acres, they say? 25, he corrected, oddly pleased she knew of him. Started with just 50 acres and 3 cows after the war. That's quite impressive for someone so young. Hard work and no distractions, he said flatly. Speaking of which, how do you plan to manage this place? 100 acres is small, but it's still too much for one person. Tabitha sipped her coffee. I'll start small. Chickens first, then a milk cow. Maybe some sheep come spring. And protection? Nearest neighbor besides me is 10 miles. I can shoot, she replied calmly. And I keep a shotgun by the door. Despite himself, Quentin was beginning to admire her practical approach. Even so, a woman alone. Would you say the same to a man alone? She interrupted, her green eyes challenging. A man wouldn't face the same difficulties. Perhaps not, but we all face our own struggles. She studied him over her cup. Your foreman mentioned you lost your parents young. That couldn't have been easy. The personal observation made Quentin stiffen. That was a long time ago. Yet you built all this. Her gesture encompassed more than just his ranch. You survived. Survival isn't the problem, he said, standing abruptly. It's what comes after that proves complicated. He set his cup down. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Hayes. Any time, Mr. Stanton. She walked him to the door. And if you're concerned about my welfare, perhaps instead of warning me away, you might consider being neighborly. Her words followed him all the way back to his ranch. That night, Quentin found himself thinking about Tabitha Hayes, her determined green eyes, capable hands, and the way she spoke without pretense or guile. It bothered him how easily she had seen through his carefully constructed armor. 2 days later, a powerful autumn storm swept through the valley. Rain pounded against the windows of Quentin's ranch house as he sat before the fire, reviewing his ledgers. A frantic pounding at the door interrupted his concentration. Elijah stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat. It's the Hayes place, boss. Lightning struck the tall pine next to her cabin. Whole tree came down on her roof. Quentin was already reaching for his coat. Is she hurt? Don't know. Billy rode by and saw the damage, but no sign of the woman. Within minutes, Quentin had saddled his horse and was riding through the downpour toward Tabitha's homestead, flanked by 4 of his men. The journey that normally took 30 minutes stretched to almost an hour in the treacherous conditions. When they finally arrived, Quentin's heart sank. The massive pine had crashed directly onto the cabin's roof, crushing nearly half the structure. Rain poured into the exposed interior. Miss Hayes, he shouted, dismounting and rushing toward the wreckage. Tabitha. For several terrifying moments, there was no response. Then a faint voice called from the direction of the barn. Over here. Relief flooded through him as he spotted Tabitha emerging from the small structure, a lantern in hand. She was soaking wet but appeared unharmed. Are you hurt? He demanded, closing the distance between them. No. I was in the barn when it happened, checking on my chickens. Her voice trembled slightly, the first sign of vulnerability he'd seen from her. But the cabin? Quentin turned to his men. Salvage what you can from inside. Anything dry and undamaged. Especially her documents and valuables. As the men set to work, he guided Tabitha back to the relative shelter of the barn. You can't stay here tonight. I have nowhere else to go. You'll come to my ranch, he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. I have plenty of room. She hesitated. Mr. Stanton, I appreciate your help, but this isn't charity, Miss Hayes. This is basic human decency. His tone softened. Please. Just until we can assess the damage properly. In the dim lantern light, he saw the moment her resolve wavered, when practicality overcame pride. All right. Thank you. By midnight, Tabitha was settled in a guest room at Quentin's ranch house. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bridges, had provided dry clothes and a hot meal. The salvaged possessions from her cabin, clothes, Books, a few photographs, and Hammond's precious farm journals were stacked neatly in the corner. Unable to sleep, Quentin paced in his study, troubled by his intense reaction to Tabitha's predicament. He had built his life around self-reliance and detachment, yet within minutes of learning she might be in danger, he had ridden out into a dangerous storm without hesitation. The next morning, he found Tabitha in the kitchen, already dressed, and helping Mrs. Bridges prepare breakfast. "You should be resting," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "I've never been one for idleness." She tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Besides, I need to return to assess the damage. I sent men at first light. The news isn't good." He met her gaze directly. "The roof is completely destroyed, and the rain damaged most of the interior walls. It's not habitable, especially with winter coming." Tabitha sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "Everything I had went into purchasing that land." "The land is still yours," Quentin said. "The cabin can be rebuilt." "With what money?" She shook her head. "I have some savings, but not nearly enough for major construction before winter." The rational part of Quentin's mind told him this was the perfect opportunity. He could offer to buy her land, solve her financial problems, and expand his ranch as planned. She would return east, where life was safer and more suitable for a woman alone. Everyone would benefit. Instead, he heard himself say, "Stay here for the winter." Tabitha's head snapped up. "I beg your pardon. I have more room than I need. Stay until spring, when building conditions improve." He hurried on before he could reconsider. "In exchange, you could help Mrs. Bridges with the household. She's been complaining about needing assistance." "Mr. Stanton, I can't accept such charity." "It's not charity." He met her skeptical look with one of his own. "It's a business arrangement. Room and board in exchange for work. By spring, you'll have saved enough to start rebuilding." Tabitha studied him carefully. "Why would you do this? You strike me as a man who values his privacy." "Perhaps I'm reconsidering what makes a good neighbor," he said, echoing her words from their first meeting. "The offer stands, Miss Hayes. Think about it." She didn't need long to consider. By that afternoon, they had reached an agreement. Tabitha would stay at the ranch until spring, assisting Mrs. Bridges and keeping the household accounts in exchange for room and board. Quentin would provide materials and men to rebuild her cabin when the weather permitted. As autumn deepened into winter, Tabitha's presence transformed Quentin's austere ranch house. Small touches appeared, fresh flowers on the dining table, new curtains in the sitting room, the scent of baking bread. The house staff, unused to a young woman's influence, blossomed under her kind but efficient management. Quentin found himself lingering over evening meals, engaged in conversations that ranged from literature to politics to farming techniques. Tabitha's intelligence and quick wit challenged him, while her practical approach to problems earned his respect. One evening in late November, they sat before the fire after dinner, Tabitha mending a shirt while Quentin read aloud from David Copperfield, a ritual they had fallen into on cold nights. "You read beautifully," she commented during a pause. "Where did you learn to love books?" Quentin closed the volume. "My mother. She was determined I would be educated, even on the frontier. She carried this very book in her trunk across half the country." It was the first time he had voluntarily mentioned his parents. Tabitha seemed to recognize the significance, setting aside her sewing. "Tell me about her," she said softly. To his surprise, words came easily. She was strong, stubborn, believed education was as important as learning to shoot straight. She used to say, "Wilderness may shape your hands, but books will shape your mind." "She sounds remarkable." She was. He stared into the flames. "After they died, books were my connection to her. I read everything I could find." "Is that how you learned to manage a ranch?" "From books." "Partly. The rest was hard experience." He looked up to find her watching him intently. "What about you? What brought you west, truly?" "There must have been safer options for a schoolteacher in Virginia." Tabitha was quiet for a moment. "After the war, everything changed. The school where I taught closed. Our family home was sold to pay debts." Her fingers traced the pattern on her skirt. "But it was more than that. I felt confined, as if I were living in a house with all the windows shuttered. And the West represented open windows." "Open sky," she corrected with a smile. "Freedom to determine my own fate, to build something that belongs entirely to me, even at the risk of losing everything to a fallen tree." Her laugh was genuine. Even then, some risks are worth taking, don't you think? Their eyes met, and Quentin felt something shift between them, a connection forming that both invited and terrified him. He stood abruptly. It's getting late. Good night, Miss Hayes. Good night, Mr. Stanton. If she was disappointed by his sudden withdrawal, she didn't show it. As Christmas approached, Silverhorn Valley was blanketed in snow. Quentin found himself increasingly drawn to Tabitha's company, even as he fought against the growing attachment. He took her into town for supplies, taught her to drive his sleigh, and spent evenings discussing books and sharing stories. The Christmas Eve celebration at the ranch was unlike anything Quentin had allowed in years. Tabitha organized a dinner for all the ranch hands and their families, decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and even convinced Quentin to play the piano, a skill he had abandoned after his parents' death. As the evening wound down and the workers returned to their cabins, Tabitha and Quentin stood alone in the sitting room. The only light came from the Christmas tree candles and the dying fire. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This has been the happiest Christmas I've had since before the war." "I should be thanking you," he replied. "I haven't celebrated properly in years." "Why did you stop?" Her question was gentle, but direct, as always. Quentin stared at the tree. "Celebration requires hope. After my parents died, hope seemed dangerous. And now," he turned to face her. In the soft light, with snowflakes melting in her hair from their earlier walk, she looked like something from a dream. "Now I find myself reconsidering many things I once thought certain." They stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough that it would take only a small movement to. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, breaking the moment. Quentin stepped back, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he had allowed himself to become. "Merry Christmas, Miss Hayes." "Merry Christmas, Mr. Stanton." She smiled, but there was a shadow of disappointment in her eyes as she turned toward the stairs. January brought bitterly cold weather and an unexpected crisis. A band of cattle rustlers targeted isolated ranches throughout the territory, including Quentin's northern pastures. 15 head of prime cattle were stolen, and one of his hands was shot in the shoulder. Quentin organized his men into patrol groups and spent long days tracking the rustlers, returning to the ranch house exhausted and increasingly frustrated. Tabitha became his sounding board as he developed strategies to protect his herds. "They're targeting the most isolated sections," he explained one night, showing her the map of his property. "Always striking during storms or heavy fog." "That suggests they know your ranch," Tabitha observed. "Perhaps someone familiar with your operation." Her insight proved valuable. Quentin intensified scrutiny of new hires and changed patrol patterns. Within 2 weeks, they caught 3 rustlers attempting to drive off a dozen cattle during a snowstorm. "We never would have caught them without your suggestion," Quentin told Tabitha afterward. "You have good instincts." "I pay attention," she said modestly. "Teaching school teaches you to notice patterns." As February melted into March, tensions of a different sort arose between them. Their evening conversations grew longer, their glances held more meaning, and accidental touches lingered. Yet Quentin maintained a careful distance, retreating whenever intimacy threatened his emotional walls. Tabitha, for her part, never pushed, but her presence was a constant reminder of everything he denied himself. She had become indispensable to the ranch's operation, managing the household accounts with precision, mediating minor disputes among the staff, even learning basic veterinary skills to assist with newborn calves. One evening, Quentin overheard 2 of his hands talking by the barn. "Boss seems different these days," the older one said. "Less hard-edged." "It's the Hayes woman," replied the younger. "Never seen him smile so much as when she's around. Reckon he'll ask her to stay permanent like. If he's got any sense. Woman like that doesn't come along twice in a lifetime." The conversation troubled Quentin deeply. Had he become so transparent? More concerning was the realization that the thought of Tabitha leaving in spring filled him with dread. That night, unable to sleep, he sat in his study reviewing the ranch accounts, specifically, the expenditures allocated for rebuilding Tabitha's cabin. The work was scheduled to begin in April, now just weeks away. Once completed, she would return to her own land, her own life. The thought left him cold. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Tabitha stood in the doorway, holding a cup of tea. "I saw the light," she explained. "Thought you might like something warm." "Thank you." He accepted the cup, gesturing for her to sit. She noticed the open ledger. Working late. Just reviewing the budget for your cabin repairs. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. The weather should allow us to start within the month. Oh, a complex emotion crossed her face. Anticipation mixed with something like regret. That's good news. Is it? The question escaped before he could stop it. Tabitha looked up sharply. Isn't it what we agreed? Yes, of course. He closed the ledger. I was merely wondering if you still wanted to return to the Hammond place, given everything that's happened. What alternative would you suggest, Mr. Stanton? Her voice was carefully neutral. This was his moment, to offer partnership, to ask her to stay. Fear locked the words in his throat. None in particular, he said finally. I simply wanted to ensure our arrangement still suits you. Disappointment flickered in her eyes. The arrangement has been most satisfactory, but we both knew it was temporary. Of course. He stood, needing distance. If you'll excuse me, it's late. The following week brought the first genuine thaw of spring. The snow receded, revealing muddy roads and green shoots. Quentin assigned a team to begin clearing the Hammond site in preparation for rebuilding. He was deliberately avoiding Tabitha, rising early and returning late, taking his meals separately when possible. The more he felt for her, the more determined he became to re-establish the emotional barriers that had protected him for so long. On a particularly mild afternoon, Quentin rode out alone to inspect the northern boundary of his property, the section that bordered Tabitha's land. As he approached the Hammond place, he saw his men had already made significant progress. The fallen tree had been removed, the damaged portion of the cabin demolished, and new timber stacked ready for construction. He dismounted to examine their work when a movement caught his eye. Tabitha stood by the small creek that ran through her property, sketching in a notebook. She hadn't noticed him yet. For a moment, Quentin simply watched her, the sunlight playing in her honey-blonde hair, the graceful way she moved, the utter contentment in her expression as she studied the landscape that was hers. For the first time, he truly understood what this land meant to her. It wasn't just property, it was freedom, independence, a future built by her own hands. And he was helping her return to it, away from him. The realization struck him with physical force. He had spent months telling himself that his interest in Tabitha was temporary, that once she left his ranch, the uncomfortable feelings would fade. Now, faced with the imminent reality of her departure, he could no longer deny the truth. He had fallen in love with her. The admission, even silently to himself, was terrifying. Love meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant potential loss. Loss meant pain, the kind of pain he had sworn never to risk again. As if sensing his presence, Tabitha looked up. Surprise registered on her face, followed by a cautious smile as she waved. Quentin raised his hand in acknowledgement, then quickly mounted his horse and rode away, unable to face her with his newfound awareness burning through him. That evening, Quentin made a decision. He would distance himself completely until Tabitha's cabin was finished. Once she was settled on her own land, the separation would help him regain his equilibrium. He would return to his solitary existence, focused solely on his ranch. It was safer that way. For 2 weeks, his plan worked. He delegated all household matters to Mrs. Bridges, scheduled his days to minimize contact with Tabitha, and threw himself into spring ranch work. When they did interact, he kept conversations brief and impersonal. If Tabitha was hurt by his withdrawal, she gave little indication. She focused on preparations for her move, organizing her belongings, and spending time at the building site overseeing details of the reconstruction. Then came the day that changed everything. Quentin had ridden out at dawn to check on a herd in the eastern pasture. A young cowhand named Tommy rode hard to find him around midday, his horse lathered with exertion. "Boss, there's trouble at the Hammond place," the boy gasped. "That fella Hawkins and his brothers showed up drunk, saying the land belongs to them." Hawkins was a notorious troublemaker who had tried to claim several properties in the valley through intimidation. Quentin's blood ran cold. "Is Miss Hayes there?" Tommy nodded. She was checking on the building progress. "They've got her cornered in the half-built cabin." Quentin was already spurring his horse. "Gather the men. Tell Elijah to bring rifles." He rode faster than was safe over the spring-soft ground, terror clawing at his chest. When he crested the ridge overlooking the Hammond place, he saw 3 horses tied to the fence and heard angry voices from the partially constructed cabin. Dismounting at a distance, Quentin approached on foot, drawing his revolver. As he neared, he could make out the words, "This land's been promised to my family for years," a slurred voice insisted. Old Hammond had no right selling to some woman. "I have the deed, Mr. Hawkins." Tabitha's voice was steady despite the danger. "Legally registered with Judge Miller. Papers don't mean nothing out here. Frontier law says possession's what counts." Quentin reached the cabin's open doorway. Inside, Tabitha stood with her back against the new wall, facing 3 men. The largest, Hawkins, swayed slightly, clearly intoxicated. All 3 were armed. "Then I suggest you leave my property," Tabitha said firmly, "because I'm in possession of it." Hawkins took a menacing step forward. "Not for long, you ain't. Touch her, and you're dead, Hawkins." Quentin's voice cut through the tension as he leveled his revolver at the man's back. All 3 turned, startled. Hawkins' face darkened when he recognized Quentin. "This ain't your business, Stanton. This is between me and the lady. Miss Hayes is under my protection. That makes it my business." Quentin kept his gun steady. "Now back away from her." Slowly, the 2 younger men, Hawkins' brothers, exchanged nervous glances, but the oldest held his ground. "Your protection?" Hawkins sneered. "That what they're calling it these days? This fancy Eastern lady warming your bed in exchange for—" He never finished the sentence. Quentin moved with lightning speed, driving the butt of his revolver into Hawkins' jaw with enough force to send the larger man crashing to the floor, unconscious. The brothers reached for their guns, but froze as Tabitha raised a small derringer that had been concealed in her skirt pocket. "I wouldn't," she advised calmly. Moments later, the thunder of approaching horses announced the arrival of Quentin's men. The Hawkins brothers surrendered without further resistance, and all 3 troublemakers were bound and loaded onto their horses to be delivered to the sheriff in town. As the men rode off with their prisoners, Quentin turned to Tabitha, emotions warring within him. Relief that she was unharmed, admiration for her courage, and bone-deep terror at how close he had come to losing her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "No." She lowered the derringer, her hand trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. They were all bluster. "I had the situation under control." "Under control?" Anger born of fear surged through him. 3 armed men had you cornered in a half-built cabin miles from help, and you call that under control? Her chin lifted. "I was handling it. As you saw, I wasn't defenseless." A ladylike derringer against 3 men with revolvers? They could have killed you, but they didn't. Her voice softened. "You arrived, just as I knew you would." The simple statement cut through his anger. "You expected me to come?" "Of course." She stepped closer. "Despite your best efforts to avoid me these past weeks, I know who you are, Quentin. You would never leave someone in danger, especially not someone you care for." He looked away, unable to bear the certainty in her eyes. "You shouldn't have such faith in me." "Why not? You've proven yourself trustworthy in every way." She touched his arm gently. "Except perhaps in being honest about your feelings." The contact broke something inside him. Weeks of suppressed emotion flooded through the cracks in his carefully constructed defenses. "My feelings." His voice was raw. "My feelings terrify me, Tabitha. Every time I look at you, I remember that everything precious can be taken in an instant. Every time I allow myself to imagine a future with you, I remember kneeling in the dirt beside my parents' bodies." Her eyes widened at his admission. "Quentin, I've spent 14 years building walls to keep that kind of pain at bay," he continued, unable to stop now that the words had begun. "Then you arrived with your courage and your determination and your beautiful smile, and those walls began to crumble. Do you have any idea how frightening that is?" "Yes," she whispered. "I do." He looked at her in surprise. "I lost everyone too, remember? Father, brother, home." Her voice was gentle but firm. "The difference is what we learned from our losses. You decided love was too dangerous to risk. I decided it was too precious to forsake. And if we lose each other too?" The question emerged from his deepest fear. "Then we will have had whatever time fate allows us. But I would rather have one day truly living with an open heart than decades of safety behind walls." She stepped closer, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. "The question is, would you?" The world seemed to still around them as Quentin faced the crossroads of his life. Continue on the lonely path of self-protection, or risk everything for the chance at joy he saw reflected in Tabitha's eyes. In the end, there was only one answer his heart would accept. Yes, he said hoarsely, drawing her into his arms. God help me, yes. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the urgency of feelings too long denied. When they finally broke apart, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Tabitha. I've been fighting it for months, but I can't fight anymore. Then don't, she replied simply. Love isn't the enemy, Quentin. Fear is. The following weeks passed in a blur of newfound joy. The cabin reconstruction continued, but with significant modifications. Quentin insisted on a larger, more substantial home, one worthy of Tabitha's dreams and suitable for regular visits from the owner of the neighboring ranch. Their courtship progressed with the same practical determination that characterized everything they did. They rode the boundaries of both properties together, planning improvements and discussing how to manage their lands in tandem. Evenings were spent in conversation, discovering the depths of feelings that had grown despite all barriers. Yet one shadow remained. Although Quentin had confessed his love, he had not spoken of marriage or a permanent future. The specter of his parents' fate still haunted him, making the final commitment seem an impossible risk. Tabitha, with her characteristic perception, understood his hesitation but worried that his fear might ultimately prove stronger than his love. In early May, the new cabin was completed. The original one-room structure had been transformed into a comfortable three-room home with a proper stone fireplace, glass windows, and a covered porch. The day before Tabitha was scheduled to move in, Quentin arranged for her belongings to be transported from the ranch. That night, exhausted from supervising the move, Quentin retired early to his room. Sleep eluded him as he contemplated the emptiness that would fill his house once Tabitha left. Even with his newfound ability to express his feelings, the thought of making their separation permanent through marriage terrified him. What if he couldn't protect her? What if loving her openly invited the same tragedy that had claimed his parents? Around midnight, a noise in the hallway caught his attention, soft footsteps passing his door. Curious, he rose and peered out to see Tabitha descending the stairs, a small lamp in hand. Perhaps she was as restless as he was on this last night under the same roof. Following quietly, he watched as she entered his study. Through the partially open door, he observed her moving about the room, touching objects with a wistful expression, the books they had read together, the chess set where she had taught him a new strategy, the desk where they had pored over ranch accounts side by side. She paused at his father's old walnut desk, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface. Then, to his astonishment, she opened the bottom drawer and removed a small velvet box, one he recognized instantly. It contained his mother's engagement ring, a simple gold band with a single diamond that he had kept locked away for years. Tabitha didn't open the box. Instead, she held it gently, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Oh, Quentin," she whispered, so softly he barely heard. "If only you could trust enough to use this." With infinite care, she replaced the box exactly as she had found it and closed the drawer. Then she wiped away a single tear and straightened her shoulders. "Goodbye, my love," she murmured to the empty room. "I will always be waiting, whenever you're ready to truly live again." Quentin froze, unable to move as the full import of her words washed over him. She loved him enough to wait, indefinitely, for him to overcome his fears. She understood him so completely that she knew exactly where he kept his most precious heirloom, yet respected his boundaries enough not to pressure him. And she was preparing to say goodbye to any hope of a shared future because she believed his fear would always win. The realization hit him with the force of revelation. In trying to protect himself from potential pain, he was guaranteeing it, for both of them. His parents hadn't died because they loved each other. They died because violence was part of frontier life. By refusing to embrace love for fear of loss, he wasn't honoring their memory. He was wasting the precious gift they had given him, the capacity to love deeply and without reservation. As Tabitha extinguished her lamp and slipped from the study, Quentin retreated to his room, his mind racing with newfound clarity. For the first time in 14 years, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The next morning dawned clear and warm. Tabitha emerged from her room to find Mrs. Bridges waiting with an unusual request. "Mr. Stanton asks that you meet him at your new cabin at noon, miss. He says there are final details to approve before you settle in. Is he not joining us for breakfast?" Left at dawn. He did. The housekeeper replied with a mysterious smile. Said he had important business to attend to. Puzzled but intrigued, Tabitha agreed to the arrangement. At precisely noon, she arrived at her new home, surprised to find no workers or wagons present. The cabin stood complete and beautiful in the spring sunshine, a testament to Quentin's generosity and the skilled craftsmanship of his men. As she approached the front porch, she noticed something unusual, a trail of wildflowers leading to the door. Following the path of yellow and purple blooms, she entered the cabin and gasped. The interior had been transformed. New furniture filled the rooms, a four-poster bed, a writing desk by the window, comfortable chairs before the fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes she recognized from Quentin's library. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and a vase of wildflowers adorned the dining table. On the table lay a leather-bound book she didn't recognize. Opening it, she discovered it was a journal, the first page inscribed in Quentin's bold handwriting. For Tabitha, to record the beginning of our story. Beneath lay a sealed envelope with her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just a few lines. Asterisk last night, I pretended to sleep while you said goodbye. Today, I'm finally awake enough to ask you to stay. Not in this cabin, but in my life, forever. Look outside. Asterisk heart pounding. Tabitha rushed to the door and flung it open. There, kneeling on the porch steps, was Quentin. He held a small velvet box, the same one she had touched the night before, now open to reveal the diamond ring inside. Tabitha Hayes, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. I have spent half my life hiding from love because I feared the pain of losing it. But watching you last night, seeing your strength, your patience, your willingness to wait for a man too afraid to grasp happiness with both hands, I realized something profound. The walls I built to keep pain out were actually keeping joy away. He took a deep breath. I can't promise we won't face hardship. This is still the frontier, and life here will always carry risk. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together. I can promise to love you completely, without reservation or fear. And I can promise that every day with you will be treasured as the gift it truly is. Tears streamed down Tabitha's face as he continued. Will you marry me, Tabitha? Not because you need protection or because I need your warmth in my cold house, but because together, we make each other more than we could ever be alone. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overcome by the journey they had traveled to reach this point. Then she sank to her knees before him, taking his face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Quentin slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, their kiss sealing promises too deep for words. 1 year later, Quentin and Tabitha Stanton stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. Tabitha leaned against her husband's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of their first child, due in autumn. The Hammond place had been incorporated into the Stanton ranch, but with a purpose that honored Tabitha's original vision. The cabin served as a school 3 days a week, where she taught the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. The surrounding acres had been transformed into experimental gardens where she tested crops suited to the Montana climate. Penny for your thoughts, Quentin murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. I was thinking about that night, she replied, when you pretended to sleep. He chuckled. My finest performance and greatest revelation. You never told me. What exactly made you change your mind? Quentin turned to face her, tucking a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. Seeing you hold that ring box with such care, hearing you say you would wait for me however long it took, it was like seeing myself through your eyes. You believed in me more than I believed in myself. I always will, she promised. That night, watching you, I finally understood what my father meant when he said the West takes more than it gives. He gazed out at the land they shared. He wasn't warning me against love. He was teaching me its value. Out here, we fight harder for the things that matter because we know how quickly they can be lost. Tabitha smiled. And what matters to you now, Quentin Stanton? He drew her closer, his hand joining hers over their unborn child. Everything I once feared to lose. You, our baby, this life we're building. His voice grew husky with emotion. I spent years believing survival was enough. You taught me that living, truly living, requires courage to love without restraint. As the last light faded from the sky, they stood together in the gathering dusk, two souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but the courage to embrace life in all its beautiful fragility. The frontier that had once seemed so harsh now stretched before them full of promise, not because the dangers had diminished, but because they faced them together, with hearts finally unafraid to love.